Well, joining us now from the Columbia Business School is the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. Here in the studio is Paul Ormerod from Volterra Partners. Joseph Stiglitz, if you were advising George Osborne tomorrow morning, what would you say to him?
Well, I'd say to him that austerity has typically not worked. The few instances in which austerity has worked or not been a disaster have been instances where the hole in government spending has been filled by increased exports. But with the global slowdown, with the weaknesses in Europe, that's not going to happen. Clear it wasn't going to happen in 2009, 10, and 11 after he started the program. And if economic growth slows down, then the hoped-for benefits in terms of improved fiscal position turns out to be disappointed.
Right.
And
okay. Now just let me bring in Paul Ormerod here, if I may. Joseph Stiglitz is not a lone voice on this. One is hearing this advice even from people who used to believe in what George Osborne was doing.
Well, economists wouldn't be economists if we didn't disagree. But we do have an example from Britain where austerity worked. If you remember back in the early 1980s when there was a very deep recession and 364 economists called upon the government to reverse policy. The government didn't, but the economy recovered, and it recovered strongly. Because the essence of any successful economic recovery is not what the government does, it's what business does. It's about business confidence. It's about psychology. And this is what Keynes wrote about. Keynes wrote about spontaneous optimism, what he called animal spirits. And this should be the prime concern of government policy.
What we got now is spontaneous alarm that the policy isn't working.
Well, I think mainstream economists, in my view, pay insufficient attention to psychology. And we've got to look at economies in Europe where psychology has turned negative.
Okay,
we look at Italy, we look at Spain, we look at Greece, and business confidence has collapsed.
Right. Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, in fact, there's a good reason why it collapsed. In fact, there's a widespread understanding of the basic economics. As I said, you can find instances where there were cutbacks in government spending and the economy didn't go into a tailspin when, and only when, the gap is picked up by, say, exports. Not going to happen now. So I think the business community is realistic. It understands what's going on. And there's not going to be any spontaneous burst of an animal spirits that's going to get you out of this.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. How much of a stimulus would the Chancellor of the Exchequer have to apply to the economy, and where exactly would he find it?
Well, one of the points that your discussion just before I came on emphasized is that what's going on right now in the UK and in many of the other countries in Europe is not only a fiscal austerity, but a contraction of the financial system, of the banking system. And it's these two together which are really disastrous. So one of the things the government ought to be doing is taking a more active measures to increase lending. And it has the position and the ability to do that because it's the owner of some of the financial institutions. That is to say, it has a very large share in the ownership. Now, both in the United States and in the UK and many other countries, governments, even when they were very active in providing money to the banking system, have been reluctant to exercise their role as owner.
Yeah, you know perfectly well they've been trying to do that for years now, and they haven't had much success.
But could I say, Jeremy, I think the real risk of altering policy is really on interest rates, how the markets judge this. Now, I mean, George Osborne has had bad news, but the good news is that the British government can still borrow cheaply. Despite the fact it's lost its AAA record, long-dated bonds issued by the British government can still be issued at around 2%. Now, if there's a fiscal expansion and the markets lose confidence, then interest rates will rise to 4, 5, 6 or even 8%, which we've seen in some of the Mediterranean countries. And that would have a devastating impact on business confidence. So I think Joe would have to agree. I mean, we don't know the correct answer, but there are very real risks in abandoning this policy of restraint and austerity.
Joseph Stiglitz.
There's a fundamental difference between the Mediterranean countries where they joined the euro, they've lost control of their monetary system, and the United States and the UK where they still control their monetary system. The fact is, in both the United States and the UK, monetary policy has been active and has been successful in keeping interest rates down, both the short term and the long term. They have the ability to intervene and to continue to intervene to keep interest rates low.
Well, do you think, Joseph Stiglitz, do you think we worry too much about debt?
Yes, I do. I think that, I don't think you can completely ignore it, but I certainly think in the United States, markets have made it very clear that they're not worried. You look at, we have inflation index bonds. We look at the difference between unindexed bonds and indexed bonds, and we can see what the market expectation of inflation is. Very, very low. The United States, in real terms, is borrowing at a negative rate.
Let me just ask Paul Ormerod what he thinks about that.
Well, I have to say, I find it, I think it's slightly irresponsible to say that we shouldn't worry about debt at all. There must be some restrictions on what the government can do. And indeed, the whole financial crisis is about sectors getting far too indebted. But if I could just give Joe, Joe mentions America. But in fact, the American economy has indeed recovered, but there have been contractions in the public sector. Since 2010, 500,000 public sector jobs have been cut in America, and the gap has been filled by the private sector, by spontaneous optimism. So it has gone along with fiscal restraint.
Right. The United States has not really recovered. Let me make that clear. We are still have very serious unemployment, a very record low participation rate in the labor force. No one looking at the American economy today would say we are recovered.
Okay, thanks for both of you very much indeed.